August 1945. Pyongyang Outskirts, Korea. The American military truck's rumble sent Im Sun-hee backing against the wall of the shack where she had spent 3 years servicing Japanese soldiers. The 19-year-old woman smoothed her threadbare cotton dress, lowered her eyes, and prepared herself for what she believed would inevitably follow. After 1,095 days of being touched by an estimated 7,300 different men, Sun-hee's body tensed automatically at the sound of military boots. The American sergeant who entered didn't look directly at her. He spoke words she couldn't understand, but gestured toward a medical tent being erected 50 meters away. Sun-hee waited for the familiar grip on her arm, the pushing toward a bed. It never came. The sergeant maintained precisely 1.2 meters of distance before turning and walking away. Across newly liberated Korea that August, 4,219 documented comfort women encountered similar puzzling scenarios. Women who had been conditioned to service between 15 and 30 soldiers daily now faced American military personnel who maintained physical distance. Military records from the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division note the visible confusion among these women when no sexual demands followed liberation. The term comfort women, wianbu, was the Japanese military's clinical euphemism for sexual slaves kept in systematic confinement throughout occupied territories. Korean women comprised approximately 80% of this enslaved population, with the Japanese Imperial Army's meticulous records documenting 200,000 Korean women processed through the system between 1932 and 1945. At the Pyongyang Outskirts facility, where Sun-hee was kept, Japanese commanders had described Americans as white devils, who would violate and then slaughter Korean women upon arrival. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka had specifically instructed the 23 women at this station that American soldiers will use you until you die, psychological conditioning designed to prevent escape before Allied forces arrived. The mathematics of exploitation had been written in military precision. Each woman averaging 7 encounters daily, 365 days yearly, with scheduled examinations every Thursday to detect diseases. The women's biological functions were tracked in ledgers, with menstruation periods marked in red ink to optimize usage efficiency. When Second Lieutenant Michael Reynolds established the first American aid station near the former comfort facility, he documented the women's behavior in his field report. Subjects appear to expect physical contact and exhibit defensive posturing when medical personnel approach. They attempt to remove clothing when given food rations. The women's conditioning was so complete that several, including Sun-hee, reported later feeling initial confusion that bordered on panic. "I did not understand why they gave food without taking their payment," she testified to UN investigators in 1993. "I kept waiting for the moment they would reveal their true purpose." What began as bewilderment would evolve into the most fundamental recalibration of human dignity. These women who had been reduced to numerical efficiency in imperial ledgers encountered an occupying force operating under entirely different protocols. The American Policy Directive 6721-A explicitly forbade intimate contact with formerly enslaved Korean civilians, with violations punishable by court-martial. The desert of humanity these women had traversed was about to end. Yet the journey ahead, through stigma, silence, and eventual global recognition, would prove longer than the 13 years many had spent in captivity. The first step began with the shocking realization that these particular soldiers did not view their bodies as commodities to be claimed. The transformation of 4,219 Korean comfort women was beginning, though its full psychological impact would take decades to comprehend. For Korean girls, the descent into sexual slavery often began with a white slip of paper. Between 1937 and 1945, approximately 12,467 Korean females between ages 12 and 24 received National Labor Service Corps conscription notices. The official Imperial Japanese documentation promised factory work, nursing duties, or clerical positions supporting the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The reality awaiting these conscripts existed in meticulous military blueprints labeled Comfort Station Construction Guidelines 1938, which specified room dimensions of 3 by 2.5 meters, soundproofing requirements, and disinfection protocols. Choi Min-ji, a 17-year-old student from Busan, was recruited through the secondary method, direct procurement by civilian contractors working for military suppliers. Official Japanese Army records seized during the American occupation documented payments of 300 to 500 yen per female procured. Minji's family received 370 yen, equivalent to 6 months' rural wages. Military accounting ledgers categorized such payments as special personnel acquisition expenses, with females classified by age, virginity status, and physical characteristics in standardized forms filed in triplicate. The third recruitment methodology employed pure force. Military police units conducted organized raids on villages throughout rural provinces, documented in the Kwantung Army's logistical records as resource acquisition missions. During a single operation in North Gyeongsang Province on May 12, 1942, Japanese forces seized 187 females from 6 villages. The operation required 4 trucks, 16 military police officers, and achieved an efficiency rating of 11.7 acquisitions per personnel deployed, earning commendation from regional command. Daily life within the comfort stations followed rigid military efficiency. Station number 24 near Pyongyang, where 23-year-old Park Jimin was confined for 41 months, maintained detailed logbooks. Each woman serviced an average of 17.5 soldiers daily, with peak efficiency of 21.3 during military leaves. The station's operational documentation recorded 89,064 comfort sessions during its existence. The women's bodies were commodified in precise intervals: 30 minutes per enlisted man, 45 minutes for non-commissioned officers, and 1 hour for officers, with schedules posted daily at 0600 hours. Medical examinations occurred with factory-like regularity. Every Thursday at 900, Station number 24's medical officer performed 3-minute examinations on each woman, documented in standardized health forms, with carbon copies transmitted to headquarters. Those found with venereal diseases received injections of compound 606, salvarsan, often at toxic doses that left permanent liver damage. Medical records show that 26% of women required treatment monthly, with each woman receiving an average of 2.2 salvarsan treatments during her captivity. Japanese psychological conditioning employed structured degradation techniques. Women were referred to exclusively by assigned numbers, never names. Official station regulations forbade personal conversations. Daily orientation sessions reinforced imperial doctrine regarding racial hierarchies and military necessity. By design, these sessions separated Korean women linguistically, culturally, and physically from their previous identities. Food rations for comfort women averaged 1,150 calories daily, 23% less than Japanese military support personnel and 46% less than combat troops. The scientifically calculated minimum to maintain adequate body weight for continued sexual functioning. Station supply records document weekly provisions of 140 grams rice, 30 grams dried fish, and 50 grams vegetables daily per woman. Weight measurements were recorded monthly to ensure minimal nutritional standards maintained maximum efficiency. When Allied bombing intensified in 1944, comfort stations relocated following Japanese military movements. During these transfers, women were transported in vehicles marked with medical insignia, false designation intended to prevent Allied attacks. Transportation logs recorded these women as special medical supplies, with inventory numbers corresponding to their assigned station numbers. The Imperial Japanese military bureaucracy maintained this systematic exploitation until August 1945, when American forces entered Korea and encountered a reality that contradicted every principle of their own military code. American military governance in Korea operated under General Order 13A, issued August 15, 1945. This directive specifically classified former comfort women as recovered Allied civilians rather than enemy nationals, a critical legal distinction that determined treatment protocols. According to U.S. Army records, Lieutenant General John Hodge personally emphasized this point during command briefings, stating, "These women are victims, not collaborators. They will be treated with appropriate medical care, nutrition, and dignity." The 24th Medical Battalion established recovery centers in Seoul, Pyongyang, and Busan within 72 hours of arrival. Army nurses maintained strict gender-segregated care protocols. Male personnel were prohibited from entering women's recovery wards without female medical staff present. Military police enforced 6-foot minimum distance requirements between male soldiers and recovered women. Violation of this directive resulted in immediate disciplinary action, with 7 documented courts-martial for boundary violations during the first month of occupation. At the Seoul Recovery Center, American Red Cross worker Margaret Wilson documented the standard aid package distributed to each woman: 2 cotton dresses, 1 sweater, undergarments, hygiene supplies, 7 days of rations, and medical evaluation forms. The supply requisition forms listed these items under Category 4, Essential Humanitarian Relief, with 4,219 kits distributed by September 30, 1945. The standardization reflected American military efficiency redirected toward recovery rather than exploitation. Medical treatment protocols differed dramatically from Japanese procedures. Where Japanese examinations had focused exclusively on detecting diseases that might affect soldiers, American medical care addressed the women's physical needs. Dr. Elizabeth Montgomery, attached to the 121st Evacuation Hospital, described in her medical journal, "These women exhibit severe malnutrition, untreated infections, and extensive physical trauma. We're providing comprehensive care, not inspection." Medical records show that 91% of examined women suffered from sexually transmitted infections, 84% showed signs of malnutrition, and 79% exhibited symptoms of physical trauma requiring treatment. Language barriers created significant challenges. The U.S. Army deployed 43 Korean-American interpreters and 28 Japanese-Korean translators to recovery centers. Interpreter Private James Kim recorded in his daily log, "The women initially refused to believe we weren't examining them for sexual selection. Several attempted to disrobe during initial interviews, stopping only after repeated assurances of our medical purpose." Military records document that 31% of recovered women initially refused treatment, believing it was pretext for further exploitation. Captain Robert Miller's field reports from Pyongyang detailed specific interactions. Former comfort woman number 37, approximately age 19, refused to accept food rations without performing sexual acts. Staff Sergeant Williams maintained protocol distance while calmly explaining through interpreter that no services were expected or permitted. Similar incidents occurred at all recovery centers during the first week of operation. By week 3, incident reports showed 87% reduction in such behaviors. U.S. Army intelligence documented testimony from 741 survivors during August-September 1945. These accounts, recorded in standardized affidavits, provided evidence later used in war crimes tribunals. Lieutenant Sarah Johnson's processing unit collected 4,372 pages of testimony, securing what would become the most comprehensive evidence of Japan's systematic sexual enslavement program. Military archivist records confirm that copies were filed with both the Judge Advocate General's Office and the War Crimes Commission. American newsreel footage from September 1945 shows military nurses distributing supplies to former comfort women at the Seoul Recovery Center. The narrator describes, "These victims of Japanese aggression receive American aid as part of our commitment to restore dignity to those who suffered under enemy occupation. What the footage couldn't capture was the profound psychological recalibration occurring within each woman as they experienced systematic care rather than systematic exploitation, a transformation that contradicted everything they had been conditioned to expect from uniformed men. For women conditioned to view their bodies as military resources, the absence of exploitation created profound psychological dissonance. Captain Eleanor Guthrie, head nurse at the Seoul Recovery Center, documented in her October 1945 report. Patient 143 attempted to offer sexual services to medical personnel 17 times during her first week. By week 3, attempts decreased to 4, and by week 6, 0. She now maintains appropriate boundaries, but exhibits visible anxiety when receiving aid without providing compensation. Military psychologist Dr. Robert Manning observed that 83% of recovered women displayed behavioral patterns consistent with what he termed enforced transaction conditioning, the inability to conceptualize receiving care without physical payment. His clinical notes described women who hoarded food rations, believing the supplies would be reclaimed if they failed to provide services. Women who had been assigned numerical designations for years struggled to respond to their actual names, with 61% exhibiting delayed recognition when addressed personally rather than by assigned numbers. The trauma responses manifested in measurable physical symptoms. Medical records from the 121st Evacuation Hospital showed that 78% of former comfort women exhibited elevated heart rates, average 104 beats per minute, when approached by male personnel, even when those men maintained prescribed distances. Body temperature fluctuations, perspiration rates, and pupil dilation all indicated autonomic stress responses triggered by proximity to uniformed men. These physiological markers began decreasing after approximately 40 days of consistent non-exploitative interaction. Lee Myung-ja's transformation exemplified the psychological journey. Recovered from station number 17 near Pyongyang at age 20, Myung-ja initially refused to sleep on the provided cot, instead positioning herself on the floor beside the door, the standard waiting position in comfort stations. Army nurse Dorothy Wilson documented Myung-ja's daily progression. Day 1, slept on floor. Day 7, moved blanket to cot, but slept on floor. Day 14, slept on edge of cot. Day 23, slept normally on cot. This physical repositioning mirrored her psychological recalibration from object to person. Cultural differences intensified the contrast between Japanese and American military approaches. Where Japanese soldiers had been trained to view Korean women as racially inferior comfort facilities, American integration of female military personnel demonstrated alternative gender dynamics. The presence of uniformed women in positions of authority, 117 female nurses and 43 Women's Army Corps members worked in Korean recovery operations, contradicted the gender hierarchy these women had experienced under Japanese control. Records show former comfort women were initially unable to comprehend female military personnel, with many addressing American female officers as special comfort women until correct understanding developed. Han Sun-hee, recovered from Busan at age 22, described her realization in testimony recorded by Army intelligence. The female American doctor touched my arm to check for fever. Her touch was the first I had received in 3 years that wasn't meant to control or use me. I understood then that bodies could touch without taking. Sun-hee's medical chart showed normalized vital signs beginning 3 days after this interaction, the first documented physiological evidence of her psychological recovery. Kim Young-suk, liberated from station number 31 after 4 years of captivity, required 57 days before she could maintain eye contact with male personnel. Her recovery journal, kept at medical staff's encouragement, documented her internal process. Today, I understood the American soldier was afraid to frighten me. His fear of causing fear is something I never imagined could exist in a military man. This realization, that military power could prioritize protection rather than exploitation, represented the core psychological transformation these women experienced. Military psychiatric evaluations conducted in November 1945 documented that 44% of recovered women had begun conceptualizing themselves as individuals with rights rather than as resources. The remaining 56% still exhibited various dependency behaviors, trauma responses, and conditioned patterns requiring ongoing intervention. Dr. Manning's summary noted, "These women are experiencing nothing less than the rediscovery of their humanity, a process both painful and profound that contradicts years of systematic dehumanization." As American forces prepared to transfer administration to Korean authorities in January 1946, the women who had experienced both exploitation and liberation faced a future defined by silence. Records from the U.S. Army repatriation program show that only 27% of former comfort women provided forwarding addresses for continued medical support. The remainder disappeared into Korean society, carrying physical and psychological wounds that would remain undocumented for decades. Park Mi-hyang returned to her village near Daegu after 3 years in a comfort station. Her homecoming diary, later preserved in the National Women's Historical Archives, recorded, "My mother cried when she saw me. Then she whispered that I should tell neighbors I had been working in a factory. My 3 years of suffering became a secret buried between us." This pattern repeated across Korea. Community reintegration required denial, with families instructing survivors to claim they had been factory workers, nurses, or seamstresses. Marriage prospects depended on this fiction, as did social acceptance. Official documentation of comfort women experiences vanished into competing bureaucracies. The U.S. Army Intelligence Division transferred 4,372 pages of testimony and 741 sworn affidavits to the War Crimes Commission in February 1946. When that commission was dissolved in 1949, these records were distributed between the U.S. National Archives, 37%, United Nations Archives, 42%, and various military depositories, 21%. Declassification wouldn't occur until 1976, and even then, many documents remained sealed under privacy provisions. The fragmentation of evidence facilitated what historian Dr. Sarah Johnson later termed administrative erasure, the disappearance of atrocity through bureaucratic dispersion. Cold War geopolitics transformed former victims into diplomatic inconveniences. As Japan became America's essential Pacific ally against communism, documentation of Japanese war crimes became politically sensitive. State Department Memorandum 76A from April 1952 specifically recommended discretion regarding comfort women testimony that might complicate Japanese-American security arrangements. This policy approach coincided with the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, which addressed reparations in deliberately vague language. Article 14b waived all claims of the Allied powers and their nationals arising out of any actions taken by Japan, a provision later interpreted to include individual claims by comfort women. Korean women who had experienced American non-exploitation returned to a society where discussion of sexual violence carried profound stigma. Sociologist Dr. Kim Young-mi documented that among 212 former comfort women interviewed between 1993 and 1995, the average period of complete silence about their experiences was 43.7 years. These women maintained their silence through marriage, motherhood, and widowhood, carrying memories of both brutality and unexpected dignity without acknowledgement. The silence broke on August 14, 1991, when Kim Hak-sun became the first Korean comfort woman to publicly testify about her experiences. At age 67, she described both Japanese exploitation and the shocking contrast of American treatment. "The Americans never touched us. This was incomprehensible after what we had endured." Her testimony inspired 16 additional women to come forward within 6 months. These 17 testimonies formed the foundation for the UN Commission on Human Rights investigation that formally documented the comfort women system in 1996. The Japanese government initially denied all comfort women claims. Official government spokesperson Kato Koichi stated in 1992, "There is no documentary evidence of government involvement in recruitment." This denial collapsed when Professor Yoshimi Yoshiaki discovered military documents in the National Institute for Defense Studies archives proving direct Imperial Army management of the system. These documents included the very procurement records, health examination forms, and transportation logs that had been supposedly destroyed in 1945. International recognition gained momentum through UN Special Rapporteur Radhika Kumaraswamy's 1996 report, which concluded, "The Japanese government's denial of legal responsibility contradicts the historical evidence." The report cited both survivor testimony and American military documentation from 1945 to 46. Subsequent UN resolutions in 2000, 2008, and 2013 affirmed these findings, creating international pressure for formal acknowledgement. The women who had once been shocked by Americans not touching their bodies were now recognized as survivors whose testimony carried weight in international forums, a transformation from exploited resource to authoritative witness. Former comfort women transformed from silent survivors to global advocates through organizations like the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance, established in 1990. By 2023, these survivors had conducted 1,672 Wednesday demonstrations outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, a weekly protest continuing for 33 years without interruption. The women who once expected exploitation from all uniformed men now faced diplomats, testified before parliaments, and addressed United Nations committees with unwavering dignity. The bronze statue of a seated girl installed across from the Japanese embassy in 2011 became the physical embodiment of their advocacy. Standing 1.3 meters tall, depicting a short-haired girl in traditional hanbok dress with empty chair beside her, this statue of peace represented both historical truth and contemporary resistance. Japanese diplomatic pressure to remove these memorials only accelerated their proliferation, with 142 similar statues erected across 13 countries by 2024. Each installation ceremony featured testimony from survivors, transforming individual trauma into collective memory. Diplomatic tensions over comfort women remembrance continue generating measurable impacts. The 2015 agreement between Japan and South Korea, which included a 1 billion yen $8.3 million payment to surviving victims, collapsed when 91% of survivors rejected its terms. The agreement's failure demonstrated that survivors prioritized official acknowledgement over financial compensation, a position incomprehensible without understanding their journey from exploitation to self-advocacy. The subsequent trade dispute between Japan and South Korea in 2019, triggered partly by comfort women compensation rulings, reduced bilateral trade by 11.6% over 8 months, demonstrating how historical recognition carries concrete economic consequences. Military doctrine worldwide incorporated lessons from the comfort women experience. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, adopted in 2000, specifically addressed sexual violence in conflict, establishing protocols to prevent future systematic exploitation. The U.S. Department of Defense Directive 2311.01e now requires specific training on prevention of sexual violence during military operations. These policy transformations trace directly to testimonies of Korean comfort women about both their exploitation under Japanese control and their non-exploitation under American occupation, a contrast that shaped international humanitarian standards. Individual survivors' later life testimonies repeatedly emphasized the pivotal psychological impact of not being touched by American forces. Kim Sun-duk, who died in 2020 at age 96, stated in her final recorded interview, "When I understood that soldiers could choose not to use women's bodies, I began to believe humans might be better than animals. This single realization saved what remained of my soul." Her testimony formed part of the 2.7 million document collection preserved at the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History, ensuring future generations understand both the atrocity and its aftermath. Im Sun-hee, the 19-year-old who pressed herself against the wall when American forces arrived in 1945, lived to age 93. After decades of silence, she became the lead plaintiff in the 2000 Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery. Her testimony about the shock of non-exploitation was cited in the tribunal's final judgment, which found Emperor Hirohito and other Japanese officials guilty of crimes against humanity. Sun-hee attended the reading of this judgment in Tokyo, seated in the front row, making direct eye contact with Japanese officials, a posture impossible for the teenage girl who couldn't raise her eyes to American soldiers in 1945. The transformation of comfort women from exploited resources to international advocates represents one of history's most profound journeys from objectification to agency. These women, once numbered rather than named, found their voices through decades of silence and stigma. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is absence, the decision not to touch, not to exploit, not to continue patterns of dominance. The Korean comfort women, who couldn't believe American soldiers didn't touch their bodies, experienced not just liberation from Japanese control, but the first evidence that another world was possible, one where their bodies belonged to themselves alone. This legacy continues through educational programs that have reached 3.7 million Korean students, academic research producing 428 scholarly publications, and museum exhibitions viewed by approximately 5.2 million visitors worldwide. The women who once expected nothing but exploitation became teachers of history, reminding future generations that the choice not to perpetuate violence can spark transformation more powerful than any military victory. The reclamation of human dignity, one untouched body at a time.